Hello, everyone, and welcome to our CMMC webinar series. Today, our topic is understanding the total cost of cybersecurity compliance. My name is Greg Powers. I'm the Senior Director of Managed Security Solutions here at NeoSystems. Ed, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Ed Bassett. I'm a cybersecurity evangelist with NeoSystems.
Great. And NeoSystems, for those who are new, we are a managed services provider to the GovCon industry for the last 20 years, providing managed accounting, HR, IT, and security services, as well as hosting services for the last 20 years in the GovCon industry. We're a full CMMC services provider, assisting companies in not only getting to compliance, but also in staying compliant, which is just as important. Okay, so the agenda today, what we're going to talk about is costs. We don't see much out there in other webinars and other folks discussing publicly what are the costs of getting to compliance. And so, Ed, we just don't see many folks talking about this topic out there.
No, and I think we see people kind of wrestling with it, right? Is this going to be too expensive for my company? Am I going to be able to do this? Or maybe spending money on things and then realizing it didn't really get them where they wanted to go, and it's a disappointment, right? Small businesses, especially in the defense industrial base, they don't have an excess of money, right? They're cost constrained. So cost matters. They got to get it right. They got to get it right the first time, and they want to spend that money smartly. So today we're gonna dive into it a little bit. We're going to talk from our experience as a managed service provider. So we're talking to customers about what they're doing, what we're doing for them, real world scenarios. We've been involved with CMMC since its inception. So we've seen, companies large and small kind of wrestling with this, and we'll try to, put some of those lessons that we've learned, some experiences we've had together. We'll put some numbers on the screen later. Are not going to give you the number, like this is the magic number that you ought to spend on cybersecurity compliance, but we want to put it in perspective, right? What are the things that drive those costs up? What are the things that drive those costs down? So that business leaders that are deciding on what's an appropriate budget can make a smart choice, as opposed to kind of stumbling in and hoping that they get it right.
Exactly. Right. And that's the thing, right? Because it's typically one of the first questions that's asked when we talk to folks, right? Is what's the cost going to be? What's the cost going to be? And again, there's a lot of factors that drive that, what that cost is. Some of it have to do with what kind of legacy systems you have, and some of it is going to have to do with, how far you need to get to as far as compliance goes. How much you're going to have to, change your IT infrastructure, or how much you're going to have to change your solution provider. Okay, so as far as during the session, you can enter questions at any time. If you're on the Zoom session, you can enter your questions in the Q&A area within Zoom. If you're on the LinkedIn Live session, you can post your question in the comments area. So feel free to enter those questions at any time during this presentation.
Yeah, please send them in, and I'll try to work those into the conversation that Greg and I are having in real time if we can, and if not, some questions may be more appropriate to cover at the end. But either way, send them in during the presentation, and we'll try to make sure we get there. So looking at overall life cycle cost, as I said, when we break this down for you today, we really want to make sure that we're hitting all the cost factors. What are all the things that should be considered? And I think if we have the conversation with a lot of folks, they're still in a discovery mode. They're like, let me understand my gaps. Let me do a gap assessment or something like that. They're trying to understand what steps they have to take to get into compliance, to go from a state that they feel like they may be not compliant to where they are compliant. And they focus very much on the left-hand three boxes of this journey, right? Understand my gaps, select or choose an architecture that might be more compliant than what I have today, and then configure that, build that, roll it out, get it out to my folks. But the dominant cost factor for most people is that far right orange circle, the ongoing management costs of keeping something in a compliant state. And that's something that we learned very early in looking at CMMC, is that there's a number of requirements in there that focus on the ongoing. So it's not about buy a firewall, install the firewall, I've now become compliant. Buy the anti-malware, install it on my laptops, I'm now compliant. Yes, there's some of that, but there are a lot of ongoing process requirements, and we'll detail those in a minute. But I just want to kind of get your focus thinking about the full life cycle, including the ongoing management. Again, these are monthly costs that you're going to endure for the rest of time that you are doing business with the United States government. So they add up, right? So getting those into an efficient place can make a bigger difference in your overall lifecycle cost than some of those earlier one-time costs.
Yeah, and Ed, this kind of goes to the, we've heard this before, right? Like it's a checklist. You just need to complete the checklist and you're done, right? And that's just not how security compliance works, right? Security compliance in itself is an ongoing program. It is not just a single task item and you complete it and you're done and now you're secure.
Yeah, and the example on the screen has got some of those things listed: continuous monitoring, vulnerability patch management, change management. These are things that take a concerted effort. So even if you get compliant through a big IT transformation project of some sort, those ongoing functions, if they are not implemented and baked into the way that system is operated, it will become non-compliant day 2, day 30, pretty soon after you finish building it.
That's right. That's right. And so again, for folks who are working their way into compliance, understand you have to get there and then you got to stay there. And to stay there, and those are some costs we're going to talk about today, but to stay there can, like you were saying, Ed, that's going to be an ongoing cost. You got to realize that is going to be continuous and you're going to have costs there, not just to get there, but to stay there. Okay, so controls that drive costs. Let's go ahead and go through this a little bit, Ed.
I apologize to everyone on the call for starting with sort of a geeky slide, right? Early on, we promised some numbers, so maybe we're going to appeal to the accountants and the budget people. But here's a security geek slide. So I apologize a little bit in advance for that. But I wanted to kind of give an idea of what are some of the things that drive cost. And then I said, well, I better put the cross-reference in there because some people are going to want to go look these up and see what are the controls, what's the actual language required by the government. These are the things that, as we are implementing and we're looking at what drives our effort as a managed service provider to deliver compliant solutions. These are the top items. So the bold items are the actual control language out of NIST 800-171, or CMMC uses the same standard. And there are 10 items in 5 little categories that I call the top 10. And like I say, these are things that tend to be bigger cost drivers of the ongoing operational maintenance cost. I'll just hit a couple of these. I'm not going to go through all of them. FIPS encryption down at the bottom is something that every piece of software that you can buy today, most of the big commercial products will come with a FIPS encryption option, but it's never the default. So it always takes some effort and intention to put it there. So for a lot of customers, that includes rebuilding their systems, building them in a different way. For people dealing with a managed service provider, maybe the managed service provider has all their tools set up in a way that doesn't have that FIPS mode envisioned. Are they willing to, rebuild their tool set to have that in there? So that could be a pretty big cost driver, even though the actual encryption capability itself isn't something you have to pay a lot extra for these days. System hardening, configuration management, managing systems in a way that is established to be compliant and stays that way over time as new vulnerabilities are released by the vendors, et cetera. Very challenging because most small, especially small business IT shops, they don't need this to survive, right? They can be a little lax on patching. They definitely aren't big on configuration management. They can build these systems on a one-off basis. They're not looking for the economies of scale that somebody building thousands of laptops might need. They can build them one at a time. And then the idea of configuration management becomes very, very challenging. So these are not natural functions that appear in most small business IT shops. Last one I'll mention is continuous monitoring. This is something that often misinterpreted in the requirements, but what it says is all the controls, all 110 controls in the NIST 800-171, you have to monitor those controls to make sure that they remain effective. And you have to do that in a continuous basis, which really means periodically, as frequently as needed to make smart risk decisions. So some things are monitored in real time, some things get an annual review, other things fall in the middle there. But this is a requirement that, like I say, it sounds easy, but when you really start to look at all the activities it takes to check up on all 109 other controls besides the continuous monitoring control, it's a lot of work. I threw a couple of also rans in down at the bottom. Multi-factor authentication. Most of us have this available now from our cloud providers, from the software we're buying, but user adoption is a big challenge. There was a release yesterday from Jen Easterly, the head of CISA, and she said that Apple has made multi-factor authentication the default, and they have 95% adoption. And Microsoft, where it's made mandatory by certain employers, is running about 25%, not the default. Other ones she quoted, I don't remember which one it was off the top of my head, was like 3%. So user adoption is driven by, some effort, some intentional effort to get your users going down this path. There's a huge security uptick and everybody knows it. So again, not a strict cost in the sense that I have to go buy a piece of software or an expensive device, but cost in the sense of managing change with my users. At the very end of CMMC, there's this sort of the last item, 110 out of 110, the catch-all at the end. It says, identify unauthorized use. Notice when people are doing bad things to my system. That's a pretty wide-ranging requirement, and it's not exactly clear how much effort that's going to take. But the expectation is, if somebody's up to no good, we have a way to detect it and respond to it. So it can drive a lot of cost, even though it looks simple on the surface. And then not strictly part of CMMC, but it's a big factor in our compliance regime. If you're working for the DoD and you're complying with DFAR 7012, there's a requirement that all your cloud providers be FedRAMP moderate. There's about 300 or so cloud providers that qualify and several thousand that don't. So often that can drive cost if you have to move to a new cloud provider, change vendors. That's obviously very expensive, or even convincing your current vendor to get that FedRAMP authorization can be a challenge. So again, that could be a cost driver, a little bit outside of the 110 controls of CMMC.
Yeah, it's interesting. The one item you have there, FIPS encryption. I've actually worked with some customers who wanted to keep data on-prem because they felt that was the best way of managing their data. But actually, when they realized that they were going to have to encrypt their drives, their servers, when you look at the cost of that compared to moving it to the cloud, compared to moving it to a provider who already provides that as a service, you can see that just doing something like FIPS encryption itself could drive your cost pretty high if you try to do it on your own. As far as the continuous monitoring goes, Ed, when we're had several discussions with folks about that and trying to understand what it means by continuous monitoring and what that means and how folks need to be concentrating there, that's actually control you have to comply to. Can you talk a little bit about what goes into continuous monitoring besides just managing the program?
A lot of people interpret this control as, I'm going to send my logs off to some managed service provider and they're going to look at it in their SOC 24/7. They're going to have a security operations center that's going to monitor my log output and make sure that anything that's detected is responded to. That's not really it, right? That's not the intent of this control. So you may want to do that, but that doesn't completely answer this control. It's a lot more administrative than that. So yes, there's some technical component, but it's around making sure that every control that you put in place is effective at all times. And that means if something stops working, you have to notice it in a timely fashion so that you can react to that. And it could be very administrative. Let's say you have a physical control around locking your doors and all of a sudden somebody starts propping the door open. Is there a way to notice that and stop them from doing it so that the door gets locked every day? It could be as far outside your IT as that, or it could be right in the IT. You have scanning and patching, and all of a sudden your scanning is missing some new systems because there's no mechanism for it to pick up the new systems that are getting built. So now you're scanning and you're patching, but you start out at 100% and then you're at 95% and then you're at 90% coverage of your infrastructure. Continuous monitoring says you need to have a way to notice that. You need to notice that your coverage is wrong and correct it in a timely fashion.
All right. And I think the other important thing about this list that's on the screen right now for folks in the audience there is that for those of you who are trying to do this internally, do it on your own, or maybe you already have a managed service provider, but I hear all the time, I don't know what questions to ask. I don't know what to ask my managed service provider to know if they're doing if we're getting compliant, or I don't know what to ask my internal IT team. If you just ask these questions right up here, are we doing these things here? And have them show you how they're doing those things, you'll have a much better feel for whether you're as compliant as you think you are. So there are a lot of folks out there who think, oh, we're already compliant. But the fact is if you go through these things with your internal IT team or even your managed service provider, ask the questions, hey, are we doing these? And show me the documentation that shows that we're doing them. I think they'll have a lot better feel. Wouldn't you think, Ed?
I agree. These are ones that are often hard to demonstrate, right? They easily get glossed over, but if you really press the point about show me your procedures, show me what you're actually doing, you'll uncover whether it's real or not real.
Right. Okay. Okay, so the tech debt factor. So this is something that comes up quite a bit, and folks are saying, hey, what is tech debt when they hear that term? And typically what we're referring to here is, for folks who want to try to take their existing infrastructure, their existing old systems, could be old workstations, old servers, old network devices, and now we want to make them compliant. Well, sometimes that tech debt, those old systems, it would cost you more to get those compliant than it would be to replace them. So tech debt can include any old systems. It can also include if you're trying to get your managed service provider to provide compliance to you, and the fact is they're never going to be compliant. That itself could be a debt to you because you're working with someone trying to get them to a place where they're never going to get to, and if they can't get to compliance, they're not going to be able to get you there either. So I think, when we're talking about tech debt, Ed, we're talking about these things that, some folks are trying to carry through, they're trying to get there to compliance, and the fact is, you have to realize you're just going to have to replace some of these things.
We're seeing that across the board, that IT transformation, although it's not a strict requirement that you move to a modern architecture, IT transformation is what people end up doing. As you said, Greg, it's the most cost effective, right? If you take a laptop that was not built in a compliant way, and you say, hey, I'm going to have my technician sit with that laptop and move it into compliance by adjusting the settings, getting the FIPS encryption turned on, getting the configuration of the operating system hardened, doing all those things, they could spend several hours doing that. They could re-image that entire system from a known good image in a few minutes. So and these multiply across all your laptops, right? Obviously, if you've got 1,000 users or 100 users, then if it takes 3 hours, that's 300 hours. So those are costs that you can drive down very fast by saying, let's just mass redo all of our workstations using the most efficient means we can and put a known good image on them. And I'm just picking on workstations. Same applies for servers, networks, et cetera. We're finding that people who try to go in and retrofit this end up spending more money, and then they still run into some gotchas. So the Band-Aid approach, Band-Aids are Band-Aids. They aren't a permanent solution. And so they spend a bunch of time and money on the Band-Aid solution and then still run into trouble at the end when they're ready to get assessed, right? They haven't really, it's not a complete solution. They've covered some of the items, but there's some gotchas they can't deal with. So we're seeing people going and saying, hey, let's just do IT transformation. Let's fix our laptops. Let's fix our network. Let's move to the cloud, whatever that may look like for you. There's lots of different solutions that are good, but it's almost always necessary to pay off that tech debt, bring yourself into modern configuration if you want to demonstrate compliance.
Right. And the other thing is, like you said, on the tech debt stuff, it can cost it. Not only is it the cost of replacing equipment, people always just look at that. The fact is there's a level of effort here too. So when you're putting your team, tasking your team, well, we don't want to replace all our workstations, but I want you to get them all compliant. The level of effort there could be far greater than the cost of replacing the workstation, especially these days when a lot of times you can get laptops, servers, anything like that for much lower cost than what you used to be able to, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, definitely. And it's probably a good idea not to lump that all in and call that part of your compliance cost, right? Because it starts to make the compliance bill look bigger than it should. If you have tech debt because you've been running the same old stuff for a lot of years and you know it, first of all, cybersecurity is a good reason to pay off that tech debt, right? Those older systems are targeted. Attackers love going after them. They have weaknesses that you can't fix in some cases. If you're running old versions of Windows that you can't patch anymore, that are out of support from the vendor, they're a gold mine for an attacker who might be looking for a way into your network. So there's good reasons, security and other, to pay off that tech debt. But just be careful that you don't say, well, wow, that's going to make my compliance bill too hard. Some of that is your IT bill, and you need to be paying that, right? Your workers need this productivity. They need systems that are effective. So maybe split it to two parts. Say, what am I doing to get my IT where it needs to be? And then what's the incremental that I'm adding on to make that, to do that in a secure way, as opposed to how I might do it in the absence of these requirements.
And one of the more common things we see there, I know we talk a lot about workstations here, but the fact is what we're seeing a lot of times is when we're being introduced to a company is that they've had a firewall. That thing's been in there for 3 or 4 years. No one's touched it since. It's been gathering dust. It's out of maintenance. Firewalls are one of the bigger targets out there for the hackers, right? Because they know when those things are out of maintenance, those become very obvious and very easy targets. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Yeah. So is it necessary to rebuild all your systems? Let me address that, because I think that sometimes people, we've been talking, Greg and I have just been talking the last few minutes, like, hey, you're going to need to do some transformation, but it's not all or nothing. A lot of companies are finding that if they have legacy systems that they need to keep, want to keep, and this could be an old accounting system that you just need for, archival purposes. It could be manufacturing systems that can't be upgraded because these are old systems that control manufacturing devices that, simply buying a new computer for that doesn't work. So there's all kinds of reasons that you might have older systems that you can't really get into compliance in a strict sense. And there is some latitude in the regulations for how to do that. And you have the ability to treat those as specialized assets. That changes how they're assessed by the assessors. And you still have to secure them, but you could secure them perhaps by something other than just laying down all the NIST 800-171 controls. Maybe isolate them, manage them in a way that they don't have exposure to the internet, to those attacks that might come in. So there's some really good isolation, segregation techniques that might either reduce your scope, keep some of those legacy systems out so you don't have to worry about them. This is probably not true for your core office productivity, right? The things that users are using every day to do email and Word documents and spreadsheets, that stuff, very likely you're going to need to have new modern architecture that's compliant. But for other parts of your business that can be handled either separately, there's some good benefits of doing that, and it's worth taking a look at that before you choke on the cost of making all that stuff compliant all at once.
Right. Okay. So this is kind of a play, letting folks know there are some things you can do that will actually drive your costs up, which, may not be the right solution for you.
It's kind of our wise guy slide, right? So what are these are things, if you see the sign over the microwave that says, don't put this stuff in the microwave, the reason that sign's there is because somebody put that stuff in the microwave and made a mess. So now you're trying to prevent that from happening in the future. So the bullets on this slide are all here because somebody made that mistake. Somebody did that. And I'm trying to help alert you to some of those things that might be a way to really blow out your budget in a way that's not necessary. So landmines, potholes to be aware of.
Right. And I think one of those, that third bullet there, the delay implementation until there's an imminent risk of losing business. We've seen this. We've had people call us to say, hey, our prime contractor has told us to stop work, or our prime contractor said they're not going to be sending us any more business until we get compliant. Now, all of a sudden, there's that rush. There's that we got to implement something right away. Anytime you do that, your costs are going to go.
Well, let me hit it. I'll just cherry pick a couple of these to talk about. The insurance company, about 4 bullets down, it talks about having an insurance company's contractor rebuild your systems after a ransomware attack. So we've seen a big uptick in ransomware. Insurance companies are feeling the pain because they're getting claims on cyber insurance policies, and they're starting to become very aggressive with that in terms of trying to limit their cost and risk. And one of the things that they're doing that we've seen in multiple cases is they take charge. If there's a ransomware attack, they assume that your IT and your security folks don't know what they're doing, or they would have prevented that attack. So they roll in their team and they take charge of things, all the way to the extent of rebuilding your systems the way they want them built. Well, I mean, that's great for the insurance company because they're limiting their risk. Not great for you to have your IT team sitting idle while some other contractor is in there building systems in some way that you maybe don't agree with. So that's it's an after the fact, but it's real world. It's for the people who are in that situation, it's very painful, and they don't have a lot of maneuvering room because the insurance company, at the time you make a claim, the insurance company takes control of that.
And the other one we've seen a few times, Ed, right, is the next bullet, that purchasing the 70% solution. You know, going to a provider and they say, oh, we got it covered. We got, 70% of your CMMC covered. All you got to do is just that little 30% that's left, right? And to make it sound like that's not going to be a big deal for you, but usually it is.
So like if you're remodeling your home and you're talking to your general contractor about what they're going to do for you and what they're not going to do for you, there's a certain line that they'll say at some point. They'll say, that's generally an item that the homeowner wants to do themselves. And what that means is, it's a terrible, messy job, and I'm sure as heck not going to do it. I'm going to leave it for you to do it. And that's a red flag, red flag with home improvement. It's a red flag here too. If you're looking at a client responsibility matrix with a solution provider and says, of all the 110 controls and all the responsibilities that are needed to meet those fully, which parts is the solution provider going to do and which parts am I going to do, right? Making sure you really understand what that looks like. There's a ton of hidden costs in there because it's those dirty, messy jobs that the solution provider doesn't want to do. It's not any easier for you to do it. If you don't have the staff and you don't have people to do it that have the right skills, it's going to be problematic. Worst case, it's an audit failure. Best case, it's a hidden cost you didn't anticipate in your budget. So make sure that you're looking at that pretty hard beforehand. Let me talk about the last one, allocating 100% of your budget to assessment, GRC tools, things like that. The folks who sell those things are looking to do an early first engagement with you, right? Someone who says, I'm going to do a gap assessment, they're not implying that gap assessment solves all your problems. It's a discovery exercise, but we've seen this time and time again. And people will spend money on a gap assessment, assuming that at the end of it, they'll have some nice, easy road to compliance. And at the end of it, what they have is a report with a lot of recommendations in there, and those recommendations take time, effort, and money. So just be very careful that before you start thinking about how big your budget should be, you've looked beyond the assessment all the way out to that operational tail. And I get that it's hard to estimate that before you've done the gap assessment, right? But the gap assessment focuses on what is my current state versus my future state. It's an important element, but make sure that before you budget this thing, you can see all the way to the end. And if you need some consulting advice to help illuminate that path, then that's great. But know that you got to keep some powder dry. You got to hold some money in reserve because the getting compliant, the maintaining it operationally is going to be a big factor.
Oh, and for those of you in the audience, you're going to see a poll question come up now. So please go ahead and feel free to answer the poll question, and then you'll be able to see the next slide. Okay, so smart spending. Ed, you want to go ahead and go through this a little bit here?
We're going to do the poll or the slide.
Let's go ahead and go into the slide. The audience will be answering the poll question.
Got it. All right. So everybody's multitasking. That's good.
Yeah.
So the last slide was, mistakes to be watching out for. So here's some smart spending tips that I think are things that effectively keep you away from the budget surprises, right? So two things you want to do. One is avoid surprises. Two is be efficient with your spending. And efficient has a couple of aspects. One is that you're buying something that is relatively cost effective for what it delivers. And two is it actually gets you there, right? So one of the big risks is spending that doesn't get you where you expected to be, and you have to spend more to get further down the path. So at the start, I would say make sure the service providers, and that could be a cloud provider, managed service provider, consulting partner, anybody that you're working with, make sure that they're contractually committing to compliance. And that should always cover their services. If they are showing you a responsibility matrix, it should cover everything that they say they're going to do. They should make a contractual commitment that that's going to be done in a compliant way. And that means that if there's an audit finding that happens and it's related to the way they're doing those services, they're going to fix it for you. So that should be a contractual commitment. And it sounds obvious, right? But a lot of times people warranty their services against other things, but not a compliance failure. Go ahead, Greg. You want to jump ahead?
I was going to say, I think that in that last bullet and sub bullet are very important, is to make sure that you understand what those ongoing costs are going to look like, right? We've seen quite a bit out there of folks talking about implementing, how to implement and get to compliance. So there's the get to and there's the stay there. And folks need to understand what that ongoing cost is going to look like. Because like you said earlier in the presentation, is that can be the biggest cost driver.
So one of the things that's new in CMMC is the idea of a third-party independent assessment. So this is brand new. It's really just getting started now with voluntary assessments. There's none contractually obligated. So people are trying to figure out, what is my relationship with that assessor? What am I supposed to be giving and getting from the assessor? And one of the things that's commonly misperceived is these assessors are not someone you can get advice from. They're not your trusted advisor. They can't be. Their independence requirements prohibit it. So they can tell you succeeded or you failed. I had somebody ask me once, hey, if I fail an audit, what's the quickest I could get another audit? And I said, well, that's kind of the wrong question. I mean, no, there's no minimum waiting period. You could get an audit the next day if you wanted to, but it's a poor way to spend your money. It's a poor way to learn what you're doing wrong, is to fail an audit, because the auditor can't tell you how to fix it. Again, the independence requirements prohibit them from doing so. Even if they know the right answer, they can't share it with you. So it's important to look around and say, who are going to be my advisors? Is it my managed service provider? Is it a consultant? Is it someone who I trust that can tell me good ways to fix problems and tell me what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong? The assessor, the C3PAO in CMMC speak, it's an independent third party. They can't be that person. So although you're going to write them a fairly sizable check, and we're going to show that some numbers here in a minute to put that in perspective, but you're going to write them a sizable check. Don't look at them as someone you can learn from. Think about failing the audit as a valuable way to course correct, right? Make sure that you have done all the stuff to pass that audit the first time. And if there's any risk of that, focus more on the prep and less on the assessment. Did everybody do the poll questions? Do we have poll answers to present, Don?
Yep, we're going to show the results here of the poll here right after this slide. We should be able to show the poll results. I think those are being put together right now.
All right, cool. So we're going to do some numbers here. So these are numbers that are in big ranges, because again, we're not trying to give you the magic bullet, and it varies a lot on what solution you're building, how big your business is, and who you're working with, frankly. So we've broken it into two categories: company level. And our notion here is a small to mid-sized business. Let's say south of 1,000 employees, because above that, some of the wage. But if your company is 1 to 100, even up to several hundreds of people, these ranges are going to be applicable. And then the per user costs, and obviously those scale linearly with the number of users that you have. You want to break into this for us, Greg?
Yeah, let's talk about a few of these items specifically. And why don't you talk real quick about what that security and compliance program line item is, specifically what we're referring to there.
Well, it's all the administrative pieces of running a compliance program and being able to demonstrate that compliance to a third party auditor. That could be a government auditor or a CMMC auditor. So there's a big administrative component around policy, procedures, evidence gathering, evidence collection, the continuous monitoring we talked about earlier. So all the things that are necessary above and beyond the IT, sort of the IT operations, to be able to say, yes, we're doing this in a compliant way, and we can demonstrate that at all times. And we have a way to identify and correct deficiencies before they become a problem. So there's also some incident response components and other pieces in that that are necessary, but primarily documentation, continuous monitoring are the big drivers there.
Yeah, and a lot of that cost there is dependent, why the ranges are so big there, because it does depend on the size of your business, the complexity of your business. maybe how many different networks you deploy, how many cloud services you're using. So that's why some of these ranges are large, but again, a lot of that does have to do with the business itself and how complex and how large it is.
It also depends a lot on how much you want to customize. So let me break into that for a second, because if you think about a large company with 100,000 employees, they're not going to let every department do their own security policy. They're going to have one at the corporate level. They're going to drive that out, and that's what people are going to comply with. And same for some of their IT functions, right? They're going to do that in a centralized way to get an economies of scale. So small businesses, if they each want to come up with their own customized security program, if you will, with all the required elements, there's a pretty good amount of cost there. So there's some cost savings to be had by adopting standardized programs, sharing some of that effort with with others, so that you've adopted things that are standard and proven and amortized across multiple folks. And that's a little bit of what's happening in a managed service model, right? The managed service provider is going to come to you and say, well, here's how we do scanning and patching. You don't have to invent that. We already have a way. It's all documented. We can demonstrate compliance of that, et cetera.
Right. So the next line on the cloud environment. So that's kind of wide range, because as far as who is doing it for you, a lot of the companies that do quite a bit of this, like NeoSystems, we scripted a lot of this out. So you're typically going to see a much lower implementation cost and one-time costs. And then that ongoing monthly, there's got to be that ongoing of, is that environment staying compliant for your cloud environments? For the companies out there that haven't ever done this before, they're going to be billing you back for that level of effort. And that's quite a bit of effort to go in and set these environments for compliance. So understand that typically the environments out there that people are moving you into can be compliant, but they're not set up that way. So there's a level of effort for that.
Let me go a little bit on what we mean by cloud environment. So today, most companies are doing things like email and collaboration, video conferencing with one of the big cloud providers, right? Microsoft, Google are the two biggest that have that market dominance. There's some smaller players, but those are the folks that are selling a subscription on a per user basis. You set up an environment for the company that has some common settings, and then each employee has a subscription. This is your basic office productivity, right? So again, email, file storage, collaboration, inter-team communication, external communication, all that has been bundled together. These things are a great value. So the prices are compelling, right? So pretty much everybody's gotten rid of their on-premise file servers and all that, or email servers and all that kind of thing, because it's just so much more cost effective to buy these big packages that are out there. But as Greg said, when you set up that company environment from an administrative perspective, there are literally hundreds of settings that have to be set just right to get it into a compliant state. The big vendors will give you some help with that, some tools, some scorecards, some cheat sheets to do it, but there's a ton of work there. So that's what we've included in that line item, is the cost of getting that set up in the right way, and the cost of maintaining that. We're not talking here about the cost of migrating user data from whatever you're doing today. We'll cover that a little later in the per user cost. So this is the setup and the ongoing operation of that company domain.
The office network cost there, what we're referring to there is a lot of times, like we talked earlier about the tech debt, is sometimes you're going to have to replace your firewall or your switches if they're out of compliance, out of maintenance.
Wi-Fi, yep.
Right. So you might as well just go ahead and get those replaced out. The CMMC assessment costs, so those are estimated. Obviously, there haven't been any specific assessments out there by C3PAOs on your OSCs. So in itself, what we're hearing from some of the C3PAOs is this is approximately the range. So if you're trying to budget it out, this is kind of your small business range. So again, if you're trying to budget this out, kind of maybe budget towards the higher side there. But again, as the rulemaking happens and all those things happen within CMMC, I think you're going to get a better feel for where these costs are.
Yeah, as you said, Greg, this is still a really nascent market, right? There's a few voluntary assessments that have been done. There's only a handful of providers doing them, so we haven't seen the efficiencies that arise as scale happens. Right. So yeah, definitely TBD. The good news is we're not required to get these assessments for a while now. So there's some compelling cases for people to go get an assessment. If you've done all the work and you feel you're compliant, get a voluntary assessment now. But you know, for the rest of us, you can wait until it's a contractual requirement, which is still a year probably or two away. And that's going to give that time to mature. Some things that can drive that cost up or down, other than just the size of your company, is complexity, right? How complex is the thing they need to assess? Have you taken advantage of things they've seen before? Are you buying and inheriting security from a cloud provider, from a managed service provider, as opposed to rolling your own? If you're rolling your own, then the assessor has to look at every aspect. If you're inheriting a bunch of things, they have things that have been looked at by somebody else, maybe them. And then that's going to keep the cost down.
And then when we get down to the per user cost down there, typically you're going to have that one-time implementation or setup on a per user basis. It could be, you know, getting the workstations, where you see the endpoint management there and security and patching it, the workstations themselves to compliance. You may have to do a migration of your email over into the cloud as well. So you're typically going to see a one-time cost there, and then it's going to be the monthly. So typically on a per user basis, your one-time costs are lower, but then you're going to have to pay those ongoing monthlies, whether it's for licenses into those cloud environments, or also for the associated services like your patching and security services like vulnerability scanning, log management, those kind of things that are required as well. So that's typically when you're talking about a per user basis, that's going to be more of a linear progression as far as how many people you have that have to go through this compliance, compared to the company level costs, which are typically more loaded up front as far as your corporate level, what you have to do from an entire company. Doesn't really matter the size sometimes of the company. You still have to have a company cost to get compliant, but then you're going to have your per user costs. And so that's kind of what you should typically expect out of if you're getting quotes for this. And typically the way NeoSystems would also quote you for these services.
And one thing to keep in mind, these are total costs, right? So if you look at that incremental cost above what you're spending today, it may be a much smaller number. So for instance, look at the user support line, right? I'm sure you have some form of user support today.
Okay.
Either you buy it from an MSP or you have a help desk. So you incur already some costs, and how much more that would cost to do it in a compliant way? Maybe none, maybe the same price, right? Office productivity, you're probably supplying your users with Microsoft Word and Office and Excel, and you're probably supplying your users with email and ability to do chats, right? Slack or Teams or something. So you've got these things here, but if they're not compliant, how much does the compliant version cost? Maybe a lot more, maybe not much different, right? It just depends on how you're doing it today. So these are total costs. You could subtract out your current cost to understand what that delta looks like.
Right. Hey Don, let's bring up the poll results.
Real quick before we do, just if you're taking notes on these some of these costs, the yellow box on the right, we didn't include things outside of the sort of productivity, basic office productivity, right? So if you're using, as most people are now, cloud services for your payroll, accounting, ERP, these are going to be costs. And most of us are getting that from a cloud provider where we're inheriting the compliance from them primarily. So there's some things for us to do, controlling our users, setting this, configuring it properly, et cetera. But most of us are not running, say, ERP on premise anymore as a smaller mid-sized business. So we didn't include those in here. Those costs may change if your current provider can't show compliance and you need to put controlled unclassified information on those systems. Some you won't. So let's say your payroll system, your HR that you're using, right? That's not going to change, right? You have that subscription there, you have a cost associated with it. It doesn't need to be compliant because you're not putting any federal contract information or controlled unclassified information on it. So it's going to be out of scope from a federal cybersecurity compliance perspective. So that's, we didn't include some of those peripheral things. This is the core productivity for your knowledge workers.
Right. Okay. All right. So Don, go ahead and put those poll results up. So hopefully seeing those here. So let's see here. So the folks who answer the questions, what are going to be your biggest cost drivers? Interesting, do not know yet. So a lot of folks there are still trying to work their way through compliance and trying to figure out, what that's going to mean to them and what the costs are there. But for those who know, it looks like, yeah, that's just some security plan, security documentation. So obviously that's driving up some of the costs for you folks. And these are all things, of course, at NeoSystems that we've worked with our customers with in working them towards compliance. So interesting results.
Let me hit on the top two of those. So the don't know yet. I first of all, I appreciate that you don't know yet, and I'm glad you're spending your time here listening to this. I hope that what Greg and I are saying is shedding some light on that, is giving you some insights into what those cost drivers might be that are going to help you identify them and put a number around them, that's appropriate for your company. For the system security plan and documentation, that's at the top of the list of people who do know. I think that's accurate. It is a big driver for a couple of reasons. It's something that most people have not done previously. Small and mid-sized businesses don't need a big fancy security program to survive, but they do need it to demonstrate compliance and meet the federal mandates. So, and it's not easy to do, right? You're trying to wrap some procedural certainty around processes that may be hard to pin down, and they may not exist yet in your company. So part of what you could view as a documentation cost is also maybe a process improvement cost. And I would say that if you think about the process, some of those processes come with documentation, right? So if you say, all right, how am I going to handle scanning and patching of my systems? If you go to your team and say, how do you scan and patch? They go, yeah, boss, we got it covered. And you ask them to write it down and it takes them 3 months and they can't. The process is probably the problem, not the documentation. In other words, if you brought in a documentation specialist and said, watch these folks and document their process, probably wouldn't be a good result. You probably have some process problems. So maybe you look at going to a service provider that says, here's my process, here's the contractual guarantee, here's all the documentation you need to show the auditor. Now, you may be spending more on that than you were spending previously, but you've got a good process, and the documentation comes with the package.
So we just got a couple more minutes. So let's just go to this slide here to finish off and kind of have some final comments here.
So we all want to drive costs down, right? We all want to do this at the lowest possible cost without making it too low. If you go too low and you fail your audit, now your low cost isn't looking so good anymore. So what are some sort of, I'll call it best practices, but again, this is really pretty new in terms of this current compliance regime. So people are still learning, and the economies of scale and the marketplace are still evolving. So today, right now, what are some things we see people doing that are driving down their cost? We talked about this a little bit, but moving to a purpose-built modern architecture is number one. Again, I mentioned earlier, we're seeing most people are at some point doing some IT transformation. I'll say this, if you haven't already, you probably will too, right? If you're still working on-premise email, or you've got a dedicated email server in a cloud provider, but it's dedicated to you, I'll just pick on email, but that's true for collaboration and a few other things too. SharePoint and things like that. If you're using an on-premise version, this is not the most cost-effective way to do things today. So there's some better options out there. Is there some pain and effort in making the switch? Yeah, absolutely. So buckle in for it, but it's really good on the other side of that. You'll be in a good place that takes advantage of a lot of the economies of scale that are built into modern cloud architectures.
And I think, we mentioned this earlier, but, really important, you want to keep your costs down. Try to implement a standardized solution. Implement something that your provider, like us in NeoSystems, has already implemented before. Don't try to do that one-off solution. That's always going to cost you more. It's always going to drive your costs up. You want to try to go with more of a standardized solution that's going to keep your costs down. It's going to keep your cost of audit down. All those kind of things that will affect your total costs will be affected if you try to do the one-off solution. Is that right?
Let me talk about enclaving a little bit. So this is an interesting term that really says, I want to segregate from things that I'm going to make federally compliant and things that I'm not. And I'll start by saying it's not for everybody, right? If you have a fairly small monolithic company where the majority of your work is defense contracting or government contracting, it probably doesn't make sense. You're probably going to be better off to bring your entire IT infrastructure into compliance. And that means all your office productivity things. Again, not things that are clearly out of scope, like your payroll and other places where there's no federal data, but all the things you use every day to manage the data on those contracts. It's probably going to make more sense to bring it all in. But if you are a kind of company where you have maybe 10% of your business is defense contracting and the rest is commercial work, enclaving, segregation can make a big benefit because you can spend your time and money on building a compliant location where you're going to do that federal work and isolate either the data or the people. It doesn't matter which, you can do either one, onto some IT that's built and managed for that purpose. And you avoid having to do a lot of the compliance on your other corporate systems. Now, those other corporate systems are still targeted by ransomware attacks and all kinds of things. So you're going to need some security over there, but you don't need to demonstrate compliance, and that's going to keep some of your costs down for sure. Right now, I think, I don't know if I have an exact statistic, but let's say about half of our clients are doing some form of enclaving, and about another half are looking at their entire corporate environment. Would you say, Greg, that's about just kind of roughly half and half?
Yeah, that's about what we're seeing right now. I'd say about, a lot of it comes down to how many of your employees, what's the percentage of your employees that need access to CUI, right? I mean, anytime we get around that 50% number, typically we're saying, okay, we may have to look at the entire infrastructure. If it's less than 50% of your employees, maybe enclaving at that point will work. So there is a cost benefit analysis that has to be done there. A lot of it has to do with the efficiency of your system, of the work you're doing. You want to be efficient with it, so maybe putting everybody in the same infrastructure works. But then the cost benefit of enclaving, again, a lot of times that'll happen if you're going to see a lower percentage of your workforce that needs access to those systems, and then everyone else will be, working on the corporate. So, yeah, some cost benefit analysis has to be done around that we will usually discuss with companies that call us about that solution and whether the enclaving can work.
And I'll say, if you looked at the numbers on the previous slide and you said, oh my gosh, there's no way we can do that in the time frame that these requirements are being imposed, then enclaving is a way to start small and grow into it, right? Yeah. You can get to a compliant place very quickly with an enclave, and then you move data and people in there over time. So it may not be the right answer for you, but it's at least worth it, some analysis and looking at that as a budget alternative. Okay, so I think we're going to have to wrap it up here. Ed, any final comments? No, I hope that this was beneficial to folks. If you've got some questions, we had a couple come in about the slide availability. So yeah, we are going to be making slides available to the attendees. And so that we're definitely open with the slides. On the topic of solutions for small businesses, the enclaving and some of that we were just talking about, Greg and I have another presentation that we've been doing recently on that topic, where we dive a little deeper into, when I say things like modern IT architecture, what does that mean, right? What are some of the choices there that we're seeing people build? That IT transformation is a fairly large cost factor, both in terms of the cost of moving over, but in terms then of the cost, you may save some costs down the road. So check back with us for future events when we might dig into that a little bit deeper. I hope this was, I hope this was valuable in looking at big picture. What should you be thinking about in making sure you're looking at the total cost of compliance? Yeah, so I want to thank everyone for attending. Again, our emails are on the screen right there. Feel free to reach out to Ed or I with any questions you may have, and hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.